Hey, what's up, folks? How you doing? Welcome to yet another episode of Cafeteria Science. I would just like to say that I have been quiet for quite some time. A lot of things have been happening, too many things, and I'm failing to perhaps strike a proper balance with generating content as well as staying consistent. But things have been happening, and trust me when I say there's a lot of stuff cooking in the background. So do not take this as maybe a tired out approach and somebody kind of slowly becoming a sellout. The content will still get generated, and I'll still keep bringing you these interesting videos and telling you a little bit of my perspectives about different topics. And recently I was attending the 97th agricultural show here in Lusaka.
Yo, what's up? Brother just had a weird moment. What weird moment you have?
Leave the job.
That's what's up.
And just the other day, my friend and I were moving around trying to scavenge for cheap stuff to get, because everybody knows, like, during this period of time, there's a lot of great stuff that you can buy in a place like that. So we stumbled across this small little book selling stand. I noticed about 3 in showgrounds, but most of them are selling novels and self-help books.
Why men love bitches? Why they marry bitches? We got this.
We got this.
Hunting for good books is as hard as finding a stable relationship in Lusaka.
But I did find something that I feel is a bit more interesting. It's called The Origins of Anti-Semitism. I don't know if you can see it. Yeah. The primary reason I picked this book is I feel like it's timely to read about these things, especially considering the fact that the Israel-Palestine war is still surging, and it's almost as if Israel is waging a war that many feel is not really justified anymore. And because of that, it's kind of, there's this negative social energy in the air towards the Jews and everything they stand for. And worse, Zionism is becoming a position that you can't fully argue for in any substantial way in public domain without getting any backlash. So I thought maybe this book would, give some context and help me understand the deepest roots of anti-Semitism. Yeah. But what I would like to talk about in today's video has nothing to do with anti-Semitism or geopolitics or conflict and global wars. It's something that speaks to what I talk about, which is science and philosophy. The first thing I would like to say is there's almost this deliberate need to draw a rift between science and philosophy. I've noticed this with a lot of people I read about and a lot of people I watch. It's almost as if they're trying so hard to show that there's areas of focus that are best suited for philosophy, and there's areas of focus that are best suited for science. And then merging the two or failing to draw the distinction is like the ultimate sin. I'm not saying that there's nothing sound to that argument. I'm just saying I feel like most of this stuff is primarily not necessary to draw that line in the sand. There's this almost subtle but big conflict that goes unmentioned between scientists and philosophers. And the primary reason people like me like to talk about it is because we are kind of like victims of this rift, considering the fact that I am also part of the brand of thinkers that came off of the influence of the new atheists. And the new atheists seem to parrot this idea that there's a certain kind of triviality to philosophical approaches when talking about very important matters. And that's a frustration that is mirrored in a lot of people. A lot of people tend to feel there's nothing substantial that philosophy brings to the table in any testable way, in contrast to science. And it's the same sentiment a friend of mine aired out when we were at the showgrounds looking for books. So we were talking here and there, and then I was telling him about William Lane Craig, because I felt like he would be interested in content of that sort, considering the fact that he's somebody that considers himself a religious person. So when I was recommending some books and some videos to watch, he said there's this one particular philosopher that I really hate with everything in me, because he kind of mirrors what philosophy tends to be about most of the 90% of the time, which is arguing just for the sake of arguing. I don't remember the exact name of the philosopher, but the point he was trying to express is that this particular philosopher used to be good at just airing criticisms and pointing holes to other people's philosophical ideas and theories without necessarily establishing his own strong footing about anything whatsoever. It's almost as if he's best suited and best poised to just raise arguments and counter arguments targeted towards people's well thought out philosophical ideas and not necessarily imploring his own body of a particular argument he wants to further or a theory that he wants to stand on. It's almost as if his primary job is just to argue for the sake of arguing. And that's a sentiment that a lot of people have when talking about philosophy or when you tell them about philosophy. They feel like the primary purpose of most philosophers is simply just to shoot through other people's arguments without necessarily giving any arguments in place of that. One time I was watching a conversation between Alex O'Connor and Ben Shapiro. I was watching it with my friend Jason. And then Jason is a little bit on the conservative side. And obviously in that, when we were watching that conversation, he was leaning more towards Ben Shapiro's sentiments. So he said something like, Alex seems to have very robust, well thought out arguments about everything that Ben Shapiro is raising, but he has nothing to offer. All he has is just all he has to offer is just shooting down ideas. And here we are trying to make a well-suited societal space where everybody can exist as happy human beings, or everybody can exist in a space where everybody is like okay and we respect each other's rights. Alex seems to be just good at simply just showing where Ben Shapiro is going wrong without really without suggesting any counter arguments that's proper enough to be built up into like a theory that we can live by. And the primary reason he felt that way is because there was a topic of free will that was being discussed. And I think we both considered the fact that Alex seemed to have brought up a very good case. I wrote a Substack article about this where he was primarily arguing against free will using the law of the excluded middle. You can find it on my Substack and you can read about it. And a lot of people in academic spaces seem to have reconciled their mind with the idea that free will is an illusion, but then none of them knows what to do after that. What comes afterwards? What's the next move? And it seems the inability to be able to offer the next applicable thing to do almost makes others feel you're not supposed to be part of the conversation if all you're doing is just offering debates and arguments just for the sake of debate and argument. That's the sentiment that most people have when talking about philosophy. But to change that perspective, I can recommend to you a conversation that Alex O'Connor had with Philosophize This on his channel. So this rift that most people try to draw between science and philosophy was well brought out in a conversation I watched by Alex O'Connor again and Sabine Hossenfelder. And Alex seemed to have been trying to imply, this is just the first part of the conversation. That's the part I want to give a commentary on. So Alex seemed to try to imply that there's certain areas of inquiry that science just can't really do or can't give us any robust answers that we can live by. And the typical example that was brought out was consciousness. Alex felt like, there's limitations to both people who take a dualist approach to consciousness as well as people who take a more physicalist or materialist approach to consciousness. What Alex was trying to get to was the limitations. He felt like the areas that science cannot probe and philosophy should do. And one thing that came out of that conversation, mostly, that first part of the conversation, was the issue of qualia. This is our subjective qualitative experiences. What it's like for you to see the color red, what it's like for you to see the color blue, or what it's like for you to take in a particular scent, to experience that from a very personal, direct level, as opposed to somebody else. That's like your inner subjective qualitative experiences that cannot be measured in any sense. So Alex felt qualia cannot be measured by science. And Sabine seemed to have implied that there's practically nothing that is unreachable in science. If you think about it, There's going to be, she highlighted the fact that she's been reading and reviewing a lot of these studies that her colleagues have been doing in areas of qualia. And she felt like, look, people are already studying this stuff. In as much as you feel science cannot really tell us or explain what qualia is, I've colleagues have been stuff I've been reading about that people are really doing this. Somebody is able to read out your thoughts as you are thinking, you know, and that for some people is an uncomfortable feeling. But if we're able to even get to a place where we can perfectly do that, or do it in some kind of like well thought out manner, or a way that's a little bit more robust, we can get to a point where we're able to tell how it feels from a very subjective point of view, what it's like for somebody to be seeing the color red, what neurons are firing, what is happening inside your brain when you see or experience a particular thing on a subjective level. Sabine was trying to say that we are going to get to that point at some point. And to kind of like counter argue that, Alex brought out this thought experiment for Mary's room. The thought experiment goes something like, imagine there's this scientist who studied color. Her name is Mary. She's been studying color almost half her life. She knows the physics of color. She knows the biology of color. She knows what happens when somebody sees a particular color and all this, and yet she's never seen, or the only color that she's ever experienced is black and white. And imagine her in this black and white room. She's never seen the color red, but she studied what it's like to see the color red. She practically has all the knowledge about the physics of color as well as the biology of color, but she's never seen color. So the question is, if she steps out of her room, of her black and white room, and sees the color red for the first time, has she learned something new? Has she experienced something she's never experienced before? Intuitively, most people would say yes, she has learned something new, something experiential that all her knowledge wasn't able to accord her being in that black and white room. And Sabine also said the same thing. She was like, yeah, naturally, like she obviously has perhaps learned something new, but imagine it like this. Let's take a different route. Say, for example, there's a machine that we can use to steer the same brain states or the same neurological firings that somebody has when they see the color red. Mary wouldn't necessarily have to step out of the room for her to be able to experience everything that somebody experiences in their brain when they see the color red. So in a sense, she hasn't practically learned anything new, because we can still generate the same experience without having her step out of the room. And for me, I felt like that's a really good answer that most people haven't really thought around. Most people would just simply say, no, experience is very important. She's learned something new. And there's a very subjective, qualitative aspect of conscious experience that cannot be simply reducible to lab coats and testing out stuff in a material way. But Sabine's perspective kind of like, puts a whole twist to this whole thing. And it's very interesting. I just thought it's something worth talking about. And Alex seemed to have considered the fact that science makes very incremental but big improvements in the area of inquiry. And that doesn't go to show that we then have to discredit philosophy. But it's just unrealistic sometimes to put these very brute limitations on the scientific method and the scientific approach. Like, here's something that science can't test out. Qualia is something that science cannot test out. This is where we know that science is limited in this area. This is where philosophy starts. I feel if we could find a way to beautifully merge these methods or these channels of understanding the human experience, would have a more richer approach, instead of building these clans where philosophy is put in another category and science is put in another category. I feel this should be tools that we should employ almost in an interchangeable manner. Like, I like the point that Sabine said, like, a lot of physicists tend to make the mistake, this one single big mistake. They don't know when to make the jump from physics to philosophy or science to philosophy. And sometimes they make that jump without realizing that now they're in philosophical terrain. But if you're able to be in a position where you know for a fact that here's where I need to do some serious philosophizing. Here's where I need to take a different approach as opposed to this purely materialistic approach and stuff like that. When you are able to tell the difference as somebody working in those fields, as an actual scientist, not us just people giving opinions, actual real scientists and philosophers, I feel like that's a beautiful ground that we should get to. And that's the conversation that we should have. And debates about science being in conflict with philosophy and this and that, I feel they're really tired, beaten down debates and conversations. I feel we should get to a more nuanced approach of both fields, because at the end of the day, what we're all trying to do is just make sense of this world that we're in. We're just trying to make sense of the human experience. And let's not get shackled down and clouded by the approaches to making sense to the human experience.